Okay. Honourable Marion Street.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It gives me great pleasure, actually, to rise to speak to the Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga bill. I must say that I enjoyed its progress through the Local Government and Environment Select Committee very much. I learnt things that I didn't know before, and I could see that this modernisation of the previous legislation, the Historic Places Act 1993, was overdue, and this bill will be supported by the Labour Party, as will the amendments that the Minister has put forward on his original SOP of some time ago, and more recent amendments as well. Mr. Speaker, this bill seeks to repeal and replace the Historic Places Act of 1993. The Historic Places Trust, Pouhere Taonga, in its current form, which was established under the Act, would continue under the name Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga. And the new name is intended to remove confusion as to the organisation's legal status as a Crown entity. It restructures the organisation, it reforms the governance of it, it disestablishes branch committees, and it does continue the Māori Heritage Council. Mr. Speaker, I want to go immediately to that point about the disestablishment of local branches of the Historic Places Trust. I, for example, have belonged for a long time to the Historic Places groups, the local one, the Historic Places Trust, and have been a regular donor to them. But there has been some concern expressed, and it was expressed quite some time ago when the bill was first introduced. And people felt as if they were going to lose their local opportunity to express concerns about historic taonga of great importance to them in their local region. And we on this side of the House got quite a few submissions from people who were concerned about that and said, well, how are we going to stay alive as a local branch of the Historic Places Trust if there is no role for us in the governance structure of the new entity? And Mr. Speaker, that was a concern that I took to heart. And Nelson, there are numbers of people who are very actively involved in local societies of this kind, and it was something that I took a great deal of notice of. So it was with some real pleasure that when we talked to officials about this at Select Committee, Mr. Speaker, we were told that and this was when we interrogated clause 101 of the bill, that in fact transitional grants were available on enactment of the legislation, and they would be based on the number of members of the previous societies that there were in that locality. So there was to be $250,000 in those transition arrangements that were to be passed across to the committees that transitioned through to the new structure. At the time that we considered this bill, there were 20 of the 24 previous local societies that had transitioned across to the new structure. There were 4 left. Auckland was one, and there were 3 others. I'm hopeful that the action of the supplementary order papers and the structure of the governance of in the bill will encourage the other 4 to migrate across to the new structure and the new legislation and apply for some of that $250,000, which could support them as they seek to develop their new existence under the new provision. So I put that out there, Mr. Speaker, to encourage the new bodies that have been developing locally to apply for that funding once this legislation is enacted. So that was something about which I was very pleased. It made me feel a little comforted about the fact that people who have put their hearts and souls into historic places, trusts, manifestations in local communities, who were feeling disenfranchised by this original the original bill, could have access to something, to some support that would allow them to carry on and to carry on the good work that they do. Mr. Speaker, this is a significant bill for the national identity of Aotearoa New Zealand, and the way that we in a modern society protect our heritage, protect artefacts and protect archaeological sites is really important. We need to be modern. We need to never discard these protections as we progress through the ages, and it is important that there have been some significant protections inserted into this legislation which I think will make a difference, particularly for archaeologists, as well as for the protection of names and, as the Minister referred to in his speech, Mr. Speaker, the development of a historic landmarks list, which will also give added protection and significance to places that hold artefacts, buildings, monuments that hold a special place in our history. Mr. Speaker, when we had our sesquicentennial, I think it's called, when the Treaty of Waitangi reached 150 years of age, a friend of mine, and I was saying, you know, this is a wonderful thing, 150 years of the Treaty of Waitangi. A friend of mine who lives in London said, my kitchen is older than that. And yes, that is true. Māori have been here since the 13th century. Pākehā settlers have been here for much less time. But we still need to ensure that this House takes our heritage and responsibility, and the responsibility for protecting our heritage seriously, even though in other people's terms we are in fact a very young country, a very young settled country. So this bill, settled country. Settle down, Mr. Henare. He's married now. He has settled down. All right. And so this bill, Mr. Speaker, I commend to the House. One of the things that I think is good in it as well is that there has been a definition of protection that occurs and can be applied immediately in the event of a natural disaster, an emergency. So there is a particular clause applying to emergency situations, and that refers to natural emergencies. So in the event of earthquakes and things with which we are now all too familiar, there is still provision in this legislation to protect the things that are dear to us in terms of historic presence and identification of us as uniquely Aotearoa New Zealand. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Nikki Wagner.
Very much, Mr. Speaker. This Heritage New Zealand Pouhere Taonga